I reported myself to HR, and it exposed my manager's 5-year fraud scheme. I was sitting in the HR director's office at 9:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning, confessing to a $15 expense report error, when Catherine Delgado's face went white. Not pale. White. Like someone had physically drained the blood from her skin. She was staring at her computer screen, scrolling through something I couldn't see, and her hand had stopped moving the mouse. Just frozen there. I'd come in to report myself for accidentally charging a client lunch to the wrong project code, something my manager, Paul Graves, had told me to fix quietly, rather than flag to accounting. But sitting there watching Catherine's expression shift from professional curiosity to something close to horror, I realized I'd just pulled on a thread that was about to unravel 5 years of fraud, embezzlement, and systematic theft. And the worst part? I'd been helping him do it without knowing. I'd been working as a project coordinator at Telford Industries for 3 years. We manufactured specialized components for aerospace and defense contractors. Nothing exciting, just precision-machined parts that went into satellites and aircraft. My job was straightforward: track project budgets, coordinate between engineering teams and clients, process expense reports, and make sure deadlines were met. It paid $72,000 a year, came with decent benefits, and let me live comfortably in a 1-bedroom apartment in Tempe. I wasn't ambitious, wasn't climbing the corporate ladder. I just wanted to do good work, save money, maybe buy a house in a few years. Paul Graves had been my manager since I started. He was 51, had been with Telford for 19 years, and ran our department like a well-oiled machine. Everyone respected him. He mentored new hires, remembered birthdays, bought lunch for the team when we hit project milestones. He had this framed photo on his desk of his wife and 3 daughters at Disneyland, all wearing matching Mickey Mouse ears. The guy seemed like the definition of stable, reliable middle management. The first weird thing I noticed was about 8 months into my job. I was processing expense reports for our team. Nothing complicated, just receipts and mileage logs. And I saw that Paul had charged a dinner at Morton's Steakhouse to Project Falcon, a Department of Defense contract we'd completed 2 months earlier. The total was $348. I figured it was a mistake. Easy to do when you're juggling multiple projects. So I walked to his office, knocked, showed him the receipt. "Hey, Paul, I think this got charged to the wrong project. Falcon closed in June." He glanced at it, nodded, smiled. "Good catch." "Yeah, that was a celebration dinner for the team after we delivered. I meant to put it in before we closed the books, but it slipped through. Just leave it. I'll explain it to accounting if they flag it." I said okay, went back to my desk, didn't think about it again. But the thing was, I'd been at that celebration dinner. It was at a barbecue place, and the total bill was maybe $120. We hadn't gone to Morton's. I told myself maybe Paul had taken a client out separately. Maybe it was legitimate. People make mistakes with paperwork all the time. The second thing happened 6 months later. I was reconciling travel expenses for our team's trip to a client site in Orlando. Paul had submitted a hotel receipt for 4 nights at the Ritz-Carlton, $1,400. But I'd been on that trip. We'd all stayed at a Marriott Courtyard that Telford had a corporate rate with. I remembered because Paul had joked about how the Marriott beds were like sleeping on plywood. I stared at the receipt for a long time, tried to figure out if maybe he'd stayed somewhere else, extended his trip, had a reason. Then I noticed the dates. The receipt was for the same 4 nights we'd been there, Monday through Thursday, same dates as my hotel receipt. I walked to Paul's office again. This time my stomach felt tight. "Paul, I think there's an issue with your Orlando hotel receipt." He looked up from his computer. "What kind of issue?" I showed him. Explained that we'd stayed at the Marriott, not the Ritz-Carlton. He took the receipt from me, studied it, then laughed. I said sure, waited. He never sent the Marriott receipt. When I followed up 3 days later, he said he'd lost it. And could I just pull his stay from the corporate travel system? I did. The Marriott receipt showed $280, a $1,000 difference. I submitted the correct amount, didn't mention the Ritz-Carlton receipt again, but I kept it, scanned it, and saved it in a folder on my desktop labeled Quote 5. The third thing was smaller, but weirder. Paul started asking me to process expense reports for vendors I'd never heard of. consulting fees, software licenses, equipment rentals, always under $5,000, small enough not to trigger extra approval layers. He'd email me the invoices, and I'd enter them into our accounting system, assign them to various project codes, and submit them for payment. I assumed they were legitimate because Paul was my manager, and he'd been doing this job for almost 2 decades. But one afternoon, I was reviewing our quarterly budget report and noticed that Project Orion, a small contract we'd completed in under 4 months, had $32,000 in consulting fees. That seemed high for a project that only billed the client $115,000 total. I pulled up the invoices. 3 different consulting firms: Nexus Advisory Group, Summit Strategic Partners, Bridgepoint Solutions. I Googled them. Nothing. No websites, no LinkedIn pages, no business registrations I could find. I mentioned it to Paul casually while we were grabbing coffee in the break room. "Hey, I was looking at Orion's budget. Those consulting fees seem high. Are those firms we use regularly?" He didn't miss a beat. Quote, 7. I nodded, accepted it. But something about his tone felt rehearsed. The 4th thing happened a year later. We were auditing closed projects to free up budget space, and I found a payment to something called Redstone Technical Services for $18,000, charged to Project Titan, a contract that had been closed for 14 months. I checked the invoice date. It was from 3 weeks ago. You can't charge expenses to a closed project. The system shouldn't even allow it. But there it was. I pulled up the vendor file. Redstone Technical Services had been paid 6 times in the past 2 years, always between $10,000 and $25,000, always charged to projects that were either about to close or already closed. I made a list of all the payments, cross-referenced them with our vendor master list. Redstone wasn't on it. That meant Paul had been manually entering them as one-time vendors, which required manager-level override. I sat at my desk, staring at the spreadsheet, feeling my pulse in my throat. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes don't happen 6 times with the same pattern. This was intentional. But I couldn't figure out why. Paul wasn't stupid. If he was stealing, and that's what this looked like, why use fake vendors? Why not just inflate real expenses? Why leave a trail? I spent the next 2 weeks digging quietly. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't confront Paul. Just went through old expense reports, vendor payments, project budgets. Found more fake vendors: Apex Consulting, Pinnacle Advisory, Stonebridge Partners, always small payments, always charged to projects in ways that made them hard to notice unless you were looking. The total across 3 years was over $200,000. My hands shook the first time I calculated it. $200,000, and I'd processed most of the invoices myself. I'd entered them into the system. I'd assigned the project codes Paul told me to use. If this was fraud, and it was, there was no other explanation. Then I was implicated. I'd been the one executing the transactions. I was the paper trail. If Telford ever found out, I'd be fired, maybe prosecuted. I'd been an accessory to embezzlement for 3 years without knowing it. The panic hit me at 2:18 a.m. on a Saturday. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios. I could confront Paul, but he'd deny it or turn it around on me. I could report it anonymously, but the invoices had my name on them as the processor. I could quit, but that looked like guilt. I could do nothing, hope it never came to light, but the knot in my stomach told me that was impossible. I'd already seen too much, already saved too many documents. The knowledge was eating me alive. Monday morning, I sat at my desk and made a decision. I was going to report myself. Not Paul. Me. I was going to walk into HR and confess to processing invoices without properly verifying the vendors, admit that I'd made errors in project code assignments, and let them investigate. If they found Paul's fraud, fine. If they didn't, at least I'd gone on record as trying to fix mistakes. It was the only move that didn't end with me in prison or unemployed with no references. I spent 2 hours that morning writing down every fake vendor I'd found, every suspicious expense, every invoice that didn't make sense, printed it all, put it in a folder. Then I emailed Catherine Delgado, our HR director, and asked for a meeting. She replied within 10 minutes. "I have an opening at 9:15 tomorrow. Does that work?" I said yes. Spent the rest of the day feeling like I was going to vomit. That night I barely slept. Kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd frame it. I wasn't accusing Paul. I was reporting my own mistakes. I'd processed invoices without doing due diligence. I'd failed to verify vendors. I needed to come clean before it became a bigger problem. The next morning, I walked into Catherine's office with the folder tucked under my arm. She was in her late 40s, sharp in a way that made you sit up straighter, with 15 years of HR experience across 3 companies. "Morning," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What can I help you with?" I sat down, took a breath. I need to report a mistake I made, a series of mistakes, actually. I opened the folder, pulled out the first invoice, a payment to Nexus Advisory Group for $12,000. I've been processing expense reports and vendor payments for my department for 3 years, and I realized recently that I haven't been doing proper due diligence on some of the vendors. I've been entering invoices into the system based on what my manager told me to enter, without verifying that the vendors are legitimate. I slid the invoice across her desk. "This is one example. I can't find any information about this company. No website, no business registration, nothing. And there are more. A lot more." Catherine picked up the invoice. Studied it. "How many more?" I pulled out the list. 23 vendors over 3 years. $212,000 in total payments. I handed it to her. Watched her eyes scan down the page. "These were all processed by you?" she asked. "Yes. Paul Graves, my manager, would send me the invoices, tell me which project code to use, and I'd enter them. I didn't question it because he's been here for 19 years and I assumed he knew what he was doing. But I can't verify any of these vendors exist." I paused. "I think I've been processing fraudulent invoices, and I need to report it before it gets worse." Catherine set down the list. Her expression was unreadable. "Why are you reporting this now?" I'd expected that question. Quote 19. Catherine leaned back in her chair. Quote 20. I nodded. Quote 21. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop and started typing. Quote 22. We spent the next 90 minutes going through the list. For each vendor, I pulled up the invoice, showed her where I'd saved the documentation, explained how Paul had sent it to me and what he'd told me it was for. Catherine took notes in a Word document, asked clarifying questions, cross-referenced some of the information with Telford's accounting system. About an hour in, she stopped typing, just stared at her screen. That's when her face went white. I asked. She didn't answer immediately, just clicked through something, scrolled, clicked again. Finally, she looked at me. "These vendor payments, they're all going to the same bank account." My stomach dropped. "What?" She turned her laptop so I could see. She'd pulled up our payment processing system, something I didn't have access to, and was showing me the ACH routing information for each vendor. Different company names, same account number, every single one. "That's not possible," I said. "Different companies wouldn't use the same bank account." Catherine's jaw was tight. Quote 28. She closed her laptop. Quote 29. I nodded, stood up, my legs felt shaky. Quote 30. She looked at me. Quote 31. I walked back to my desk, sat down, stared at my computer screen without seeing it. My brain was looping the same thought. Paul had been stealing from the company for years, and I'd been his unwitting accomplice. 20 minutes later, Catherine called me back to her office. This time, 2 other people were there. One was Jeffrey Hale, Telford's chief financial officer. Mid-50s, glasses, the kind of guy who wore a tie every day even though nobody else did. The other was a woman I didn't recognize. Late 30s, sharp suit, leather portfolio. Catherine introduced her as Adrienne Cross, outside counsel from Whitman & Cole LLP, 14 years in corporate litigation and compliance. "We need to ask you some questions," Jeffrey said. His tone was clipped. "All business." "How long have you been processing these invoices?" I told him. 3 years, since I started. "And you never questioned why your manager was using vendors with no online presence?" I had questioned it. I'd mentioned it to Paul. He'd explained it away. I did ask. He told me they were specialized subcontractors, small firms that don't advertise. I believed him because he's my manager, and he's been here almost 20 years. Adrienne leaned forward. "Did Paul Graves ever ask you to falsify documents, alter dates, change amounts, Backdate invoices? I shook my head. No. He'd just send me the invoices and tell me which project code to use. I entered them as they were. She made a note. Did you receive any benefit from these transactions? Payments? Gifts? Favors? My throat tightened. No. Nothing. I didn't even know they were fake until last week. Jeffrey exchanged a glance with Adrian. She nodded slightly. We're going to need you to provide a formal statement, she said. Everything you just told us in writing, signed and dated. We'll also need access to any documentation you've saved. Emails, invoices, spreadsheets, anything related to these vendors. I gave them everything. Every file I'd saved in that, quote, 42 folder. Every email from Paul. Every scanned receipt. It took 3 hours to compile and hand over. By the time I left Catherine's office, it was past 1 p.m., and I hadn't eaten. Couldn't eat. The knot in my stomach was too tight. I went back to my desk. Paul wasn't in his office. I checked his calendar. He was in a meeting with a client. Probably had no idea what was happening. Or maybe he did. Maybe he'd seen me go into HR twice that morning and already knew he was done. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to work while checking my email every 30 seconds, waiting for something to happen. At 4:52 p.m., Paul walked past my desk. Hey, you good? You've been quiet today. I looked up, forced a smile. Yeah, just working through some budget stuff. He nodded. Let me know if you need anything. Then he went into his office and closed the door. 15 minutes later, Catherine called him. I watched through the glass walls as he answered, listened, then stood up and grabbed his jacket. He walked toward the elevator without looking at me. Didn't come back. The next morning, Paul's office was empty. His computer was gone. His framed Disneyland photo, his coffee mug, the little motivational placard that said, "Success is the sum of small efforts repeated daily," had all gone. There was a note on his door. Please direct any questions to Catherine Delgado, HR. I knew what that meant. He'd been suspended, probably escorted out by security after his meeting with Catherine yesterday. The department was buzzing. People kept asking me what happened. I said I didn't know. Kept my head down. Tried to focus on work, but every time someone walked past my desk, I felt their eyes on me. Judging. Speculating. By lunch, the rumors had started. Paul had been stealing. Paul had been inappropriate with an employee. Paul had falsified a report. Nobody knew the truth, but everyone had a theory. And most of those theories involved me somehow. I was the newest person on the team. I'd been in HR's office all morning. I was the obvious connection. That afternoon, I got called back to HR. This time, it was just Catherine and Adrian. We've initiated a full forensic audit, Adrian said. We've hired an external firma Rao Strickland Forensic Accounting, led by Nathan Avery, 22 years in financial fraud investigation. He'll be reviewing every transaction Paul Graves approved over the past 6 years. We're also filing a report with the FBI. This level of embezzlement crosses into federal wire fraud territory. My chest tightened. FBI. What does that mean for me? Catherine answered. You're not a target. You're a witness. Nathan will interview you as part of the audit, and you may be asked to provide testimony if this goes to trial. But based on what you've shown us, you were a victim of Paul's deception, not a participant. But being a witness didn't feel much better than being a suspect. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept replaying every interaction I'd had with Paul, every invoice I'd processed, every time he'd smiled at me and told me I was doing great work. Had he been laughing at me the whole time, thinking about how easy I was to manipulate? Or had he genuinely not thought about me at all, just saw me as a tool, a means to execute his scheme? I felt stupid, naive. How had I not seen it? How had I processed hundreds of fraudulent invoices without catching on? The rational part of my brain knew I'd done the right thing by reporting it. But the emotional part kept circling back to the same question. Why hadn't I figured it out sooner? Nathan Avery showed up 3 days later, tall, gray-haired, meticulous in a way that made accountants look chaotic. He set up in a conference room with boxes of printed financial records and 3 laptops. The man worked like a machine. 12-hour days, barely stopped for lunch, asked questions that revealed patterns I hadn't even considered. I spent 6 hours with him over 2 days, walking through every invoice, every vendor, every transaction. He asked questions I couldn't have anticipated. Quote 52. I thought about it, shook my head. Quote, 53. Nathan made a note. Quote, 54. I didn't. He told me. It was Paul's wife's maiden name, Teresa Whitfield. He'd opened the account 7 years ago, 2 years before he started creating the fake vendors. Routed all the payments there. Withdrew cash regularly, or transferred it to personal accounts in small increments to avoid detection. Over 5 years, he'd stolen $438,000. I felt sick. $438,000. He'd stolen nearly $500,000, and I'd helped him do it. I processed those invoices, I said. I entered them into the system. If I'd just verified the vendors, Nathan cut me off. You were doing your job. Your manager told you to process invoices, and you processed them. You're not an accountant. You're not an auditor. You had no reason to suspect fraud until the pattern became obvious. And when it did, you reported it immediately. He leaned back. Paul Graves is a professional fraudster. He's been doing this for 5 years without getting caught because he knew exactly how to exploit the system. He stayed under approval thresholds. He used project codes that were closing or closed to hide the payments. He built trust over 19 years so that people like you wouldn't question him. This isn't on you. But it felt like it was. Nathan showed me something else, a spreadsheet he'd built showing the frequency of Paul's fraudulent invoices over time. In the first year, he'd submitted 6 fake invoices, total $38,000. The second year, 11 invoices, $63,000. The third year, 18 invoices, $92,000. Each year, he got bolder, more frequent, larger amounts, Nathan said. Quote 60. Nathan tapped the screen. Quote 61. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, Paul never came back to the office. HR wouldn't confirm if he'd been fired or if he'd resigned, but his office remained empty, and his name disappeared from the company directory. I was assigned a new manager, Linda Ortega, transferred from our California office, 26 years in aerospace project management. She was efficient, no nonsense, and didn't ask about Paul, just wanted to understand our current projects and make sure deliverables were on track. I appreciated that. The rest of the department treated me like I had a disease. Nobody said anything directly, but I could feel the speculation. They knew I'd gone to HR. They knew Paul was gone. They assumed I'd ratted him out for something petty, that I was a snitch, that I'd gotten a good man fired. One afternoon, I was in the break room getting coffee when 2 engineers from our team walked in. They didn't see me at first. Quote 62, one of them said. Quote 63. The other guy shook his head. Quote 64. Then they saw me, went quiet, poured their coffee, and left. I stood there holding my mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms, wondering if I should tell them the truth. But Catherine had been clear. Don't discuss the investigation. So I didn't. I stopped eating lunch in the break room, stopped going to happy hours, just did my work and went home. My apartment felt smaller, quieter. I'd been living alone since college, 28 years old, and never had a serious relationship, never felt the need. Work had been my social life. Now work felt toxic. I started applying to other jobs. Nothing serious, just browsing listings, updating my resume, thinking about starting over somewhere that didn't know about Paul or the fraud or any of it. But every time I opened a job posting, I'd close it again. Running felt like guilt, like admitting I'd done something wrong. Catherine checked in with me weekly, mostly procedural updates. The forensic audit was ongoing. The FBI had opened an investigation. Telford's legal team was working with federal prosecutors. Paul had hired a lawyer, some guy named Donald Krasner, former federal prosecutor turned defense attorney, 29 years in criminal law. Krasner was known for defending white-collar criminals, corporate fraud, tax evasion. The kind of cases where the defendants wore suits to court and got sentenced to minimum security facilities that looked more like college campuses than prisons. Paul wasn't cooperating with the investigation, hadn't provided any statement, was invoking his Fifth Amendment rights on everything. Smart, probably. But it made the investigation harder. Without his cooperation, prosecutors had to build the case entirely from documents and witness testimony. That meant more interviews, more questions, more time. Then, 8 weeks after I'd walked into Catherine's office, I got a call from an FBI agent, Special Agent Nicole Carver, 12 years with the Bureau's white-collar crime division, worked out of the Phoenix field office. She wanted to interview me formally. We met at a Starbucks near my apartment. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with a briefcase full of documents and a digital recorder. Quote, 65, she said. Quote, 66. She asked the same questions everyone else had asked, but sharper, more detailed. How did Paul send you the invoices? Email. Were they always PDFs? Yes. Did he ever ask you to delete emails? No. Did he ever suggest you keep information from other managers? Not explicitly, but he'd tell me to handle things quietly sometimes. Did he ever give you gifts? No. Take you to lunch? Occasionally, but he did that with the whole team. Did you ever have any indication he was living beyond his means? No. He drove a Subaru and wore clothes from Target. Nothing suggested wealth. She recorded everything. 2 hours of testimony. At the end, she handed me her card, said I might be called to testify if it went to trial. One more thing, she said as I was standing to leave. Did Paul ever mention a colleague named Brent Schaffer? I sat back down. Yeah, Brent worked in procurement, retired about 2 years ago. Why? Nicole made a note. We're investigating whether Paul had accomplices. Brent's name came up in some of the older transactions. Did they work together closely? I thought about it. Not that I saw, but Brent signed off on vendor approvals. He would have been one of the people who could have flagged the fake vendors if he'd looked closely. Nicole nodded. We're talking to him next week. That conversation stuck with me. The idea that Paul might not have been working alone, that there might be other people at Telford who knew what was happening and did nothing, or worse, helped. I started looking through old emails again, searching for any interaction between Paul and Brent. Found a few. Casual stuff. Can you approve this vendor for me? Sure, no problem. Nothing obviously incriminating. But the ease of it bothered me. How simple it had been for Paul to get approvals. How little oversight there was. Telford had systems in place. Vendor verification processes, spending thresholds, audit requirements. But they were only effective if people actually followed them, and Paul had been banking on the fact that nobody would. He'd been right for 5 years. 3 months later, the FBI concluded their investigation. No charges against Brent. He'd been negligent, but not criminal. Just a guy who rubber-stamped approvals without doing his job properly. Telford fired him anyway. Liability risk. They couldn't keep someone who'd enabled fraud, even unintentionally. I felt bad for him. He'd lost his retirement, his reputation, his legacy at the company, all because he'd been lazy. But then I thought about the $438,000. About the projects that had been underfunded because budget had been siphoned off. About the employees who hadn't gotten raises because the company thought money was tight. Brent's laziness had consequences. So did mine. Even if I hadn't been prosecuted, I'd still been part of it. Paul Graves was indicted 3 months after that. 18 counts of wire fraud and money laundering. The indictment was public record. I read it online, sitting in my apartment at 11 p.m., scrolling through page after page of legal language. The details were meticulous. Every fake vendor, every fraudulent invoice, every payment. $438,000 stolen over 5 years. The prosecution laid it out like a textbook case. Paul had created shell companies using his wife's maiden name, filed fake business registrations in Delaware where oversight was minimal, opened a business bank account under each shell, then invoiced Telford for non-existent services. He'd routed the payments through me because I was junior, trusting, and wouldn't question a manager with 19 years of tenure. He'd kept the amount small enough to avoid triggering audits, but frequent enough to generate significant income. He'd been pulling in $70,000 to $90,000 a year on top of his salary. Tax-free because he never reported it. The IRS was involved now, too. They'd opened their own investigation into unreported income. Paul was looking at tax evasion charges on top of the wire fraud. His attorney, Krasner, released a statement. Paul maintained his innocence, claimed the vendors were legitimate, said he was being scapegoated by a company trying to cover up its own accounting failures. It was a weak defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The trial was set for 9 months out. In the meantime, Telford settled with their insurance carrier, recovered most of the stolen funds, and implemented new financial controls. Every vendor now required verification through a third-party service called Veridian Systems, specialized in corporate vendor validation. Every expense over $1,000 needed dual approval from separate managers. Every project budget was reviewed quarterly by an independent auditor. The changes were expensive. Telford was spending an extra $150,000 a year on compliance, but Jeffrey Hale said it was necessary. "We can't let this happen again," he told the staff in an all-hands meeting. "Paul Graves exploited gaps in our system. We're closing those gaps." He didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew I was the one who'd exposed it. My role changed. I was promoted, technically, to senior project coordinator with a 15% raise, $83,000 a year now. But it felt hollow. I knew it was partly to keep me from talking to the press, partly to compensate for the months of stress. Linda Ortega was a good manager, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that I should have seen the fraud earlier. That if I'd been smarter, more diligent, none of this would have happened. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Jonathan Fisk, licensed clinical psychologist, 18 years in practice, office in Scottsdale with abstract art on the walls and a white noise machine outside the door. He specialized in workplace trauma, helped people process job loss, harassment, organizational change. I told him everything: the guilt, the isolation, the feeling that I'd destroyed someone's life, even though they'd been committing crimes. "You reported it the moment you understood what it was," he said during our third session. "That's all anyone could ask. You're not responsible for Paul's choices." Logically, I knew that. Emotionally, I still felt complicit. Dr. Fisk had me do an exercise. Write down every decision I'd made during the 3 years I'd worked with Paul. Every moment where I could have done something differently. I filled 4 pages, should have verified vendors immediately. Should have questioned the closed project charges, should have flagged the duplicate expenses, should have reported the Ritz-Carlton receipt. Every should have felt like a failure. Then Dr. Fisk had me go through the list and mark which decisions I'd had enough information to make differently at the time, not in hindsight, at the time. The list shrank. Most of my quote 81 had been based on trusting my manager, something every employee is expected to do. Quote 82. Dr. Fisk said. Quote 83. It helped. A little. But I still felt like I was walking around with a scarlet letter. The person who got Paul Graves arrested, the snitch, the guy who couldn't be trusted. 6 months after the indictment, I went to an industry conference in Denver, aerospace project management seminar, networking event on the second night. I was at the bar getting a drink when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned. It was Brent Schaffer, the procurement guy Telford had fired. He looked older, thinner, tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. I wanted to say no, wanted to walk away. But something in his expression stopped me. We found a quiet corner, sat down. Brent ordered a whiskey, drank half of it before speaking. "I know you think I was involved," he said, "that I helped Paul, but I didn't. I was just lazy. I approved vendors without checking them because I trusted Paul, and I was busy, and I didn't think it mattered." He finished the whiskey. "I lost my pension. My wife left me. I can't get hired anywhere because Telford won't give me a reference. My life is over because I didn't do my job properly." I didn't know what to say. Quote 88 felt inadequate. Quote 89 felt cruel. So I just sat there. Brent looked at me. Quote 90. He stood up, shook my hand, walked away. I sat there for another 20 minutes, staring at my drink, thinking about how many people Paul's fraud had destroyed. Not just himself, me, Brent, his wife, his daughters, everyone who'd been connected to him. Fraud doesn't just hurt the company. It ripples out, touches everyone. The trial was in June, federal courthouse in Phoenix. Marble floors and wood-paneled walls, and a jury of 12 people who looked at me like I was either a hero or a collaborator, depending on which attorney was questioning me. I testified on the third day, wore a suit Linda had helped me pick out, navy, conservative, the kind of thing that said, credible witness. The prosecution went first. Led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Ramona Delgado, 19 years with the Justice Department, specialized in financial crimes. She walked me through the timeline. How I'd started at Telford, how Paul had sent me invoices, how I'd processed them without knowing they were fake, how I'd eventually noticed the pattern and reported it. She showed the jury documents, emails from Paul, fake invoices, my statement to HR, the spreadsheet I'd compiled showing all the suspicious vendors. At any point, Ramona asked, did you receive any benefit from these fraudulent transactions? I said no. Did Paul Graves ever tell you the vendors were fake? No. When you discovered the fraud, what did you do? I reported myself to HR immediately. Ramona nodded, thanked me, sat down. Then Krasner stood up. Paul's defense attorney, late 50s, expensive suit, the kind of presence that filled a room. He smiled at me. Not friendly, predatory, he said. Quote, 97. I said yes. Quote, 98. I felt my jaw tighten. Quote, 99. Krasner raised an eyebrow. Quote, 100 as. The way he said it made it sound like I was either complicit or stupid. Quote, 101. I repeated. Quote, 102. Krasner smiled again. Quote, 103. He walked closer to the witness stand. Quote, 104. I stared at him. Quote, 105. He pulled out a document. Quote, 106. I remembered that email. Quote, 107. Krasner leaned on the stand. Quote, 108. Ramona objected. The judge sustained it, told Krasner to move on, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the accusation. Some of them were looking at me differently now, suspicious. The cross-examination lasted 40 minutes. By the end, I was exhausted. Felt like I'd been beaten. When I stepped down, I didn't look at Paul. Didn't want to see his face. Just walked out of the courtroom and sat in the hallway until Ramona found me. You did fine, she said. Krasner's just doing his job. The jury won't buy it. We have too much evidence. I hoped she was right. The trial lasted 8 days. Other witnesses testified. Nathan Avery walked the jury through the forensic audit. Catherine Delgado explained how I'd come forward voluntarily. Jeffrey Hale testified about Telford's financial controls and how Paul had exploited them. Special Agent Nicole Carver presented evidence of the shell companies and the bank account in Teresa Whitfield's name. Paul's wife testified too, said she didn't know about the account, that Paul had opened it without telling her, that she'd thought the extra money was from bonuses and consulting work he did on the side. The prosecution showed records proving she'd withdrawn cash from the account multiple times. She claimed Paul had told her it was his money from side projects. She was either lying or willfully ignorant. Hard to tell. Paul didn't testify. Krasner advised against it. The prosecution's case was too strong. Anything Paul said would just give them more ammunition. So he sat there, silent, while witness after witness detailed his crimes. The defense tried to paint him as a scapegoat, argued that Telford's accounting systems were so poorly managed that anyone could have committed the fraud, suggested that maybe I'd done it. Maybe Brent. Maybe someone else entirely. It was desperate. Grasping. The jury saw through it. They deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all 18 counts. Paul showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Just sat there, blank-faced, while his lawyer shuffled papers and his wife sobbed in the gallery. The judge set a sentencing date for 6 weeks later. I didn't stay for the rest, just left the courthouse, got in my car, and drove home. Sat in my apartment. Felt nothing. Not relief, not vindication, just emptiness. Sentencing was in August. I didn't attend, but Catherine sent me the details. 8 years in federal prison. Restitution of $438,000. Paul would serve his time at a minimum security facility in California. Be eligible for parole in 5 years if he maintained good behavior. His wife filed for divorce 3 days after the sentencing. His oldest daughter, who'd been studying engineering at Arizona State, transferred to a school in Oregon, wanted to get away from the publicity. Paul's name was in the newspaper, on local news, on legal blogs. I didn't read most of it. Couldn't. Every article felt like it was partially about me. The employee who reported him, the one who exposed the scheme. Some painted me as a hero. Others left it ambiguous, made it sound like maybe I'd been involved. The comment sections were brutal. People arguing about whether I was a whistleblower or a snitch, whether Paul deserved 8 years or deserved more, whether Telford was at fault for having weak controls. I stopped reading after the first few. It wasn't worth it. I stayed at Telford for another year. Got another promotion, another raise, $96,000 now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone saw me as the guy who destroyed Paul Graves. Some people thanked me privately, told me I'd done the right thing, that I'd saved the company from worse damage, that Paul could have stolen millions if he'd kept going. Others avoided me, treated me like I'd broken some unspoken code. You don't report your manager. You don't blow up someone's life over money, even when that money was stolen, even when that someone had been committing felonies for 5 years. The worst were the people who acted like nothing had happened, who smiled at me in meetings and then whispered to each other when I walked away. I could feel their judgment, their speculation. The department never recovered. 3 people quit in the 6 months after Paul's trial. 2 more transferred to different divisions. Linda did her best to rebuild morale, but the damage was done. Trust was gone. Everyone was suspicious of everyone else. I left Telford in November, took a job at a smaller firm in Colorado. Clean slate. Nobody knew about Paul or the trial or any of it. I told them I'd left for career growth, which was technically true, just not the whole truth. The new job paid a little less, $88,000, but the work environment was healthier. No ghosts, no whispers, just engineering projects and normal office politics. I'm doing fine now. The guilt has faded, mostly, replaced by something quieter, an understanding that I did what I could with the information I had, that reporting myself to HR was the only move that made sense, that the fraud would have come out eventually, and me coming forward just accelerated it. Paul's serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Lompoc, California. I looked him up once, couldn't help it. Inmate number 94826-061, release date March 2031. He's eligible for parole in 2028. His daughters are doing okay, from what I can tell from social media. His oldest graduated from Oregon State. His middle daughter is at community college. The youngest is still in high school. I wonder if they know what he did, if they understand, if they blame me. His ex-wife remarried, moved to Nevada, started over. Everyone moved on except Paul, and maybe me. Sometimes I think about that morning in Catherine's office, how I walked in planning to confess to a $15 error and ended up unraveling a 5-year fraud scheme, how a single decision to come forward voluntarily changed everything. Paul's life, my career, the company's financial controls, Brent's retirement, Teresa's marriage, the ripples spread so far, touched so many people, all because I decided to tell the truth. Dr. Fisk told me once that integrity isn't about grand gestures or moral courage. It's about small decisions made when no one's watching, about doing the right thing even when it's terrifying, even when it costs you. I think about that a lot. The truth is, I didn't set out to be a whistleblower. I just wanted to do the right thing before the wrong thing buried me. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all anyone can do. Notice when something's wrong. Say something. Deal with the consequences. It's not heroic, it's just human. I reported myself to HR and it exposed my manager's 5-year fraud scheme. But more than that, it taught me that the hardest person to be honest with is yourself. And once you are, everything else gets a little bit clearer. Even if it's terrifying. Even if the truth destroys everything you thought you knew. Paul used to have a placard on his desk. Success is the sum of small efforts repeated daily. I think about that sometimes. How he repeated small thefts daily. How I repeated small compromises daily. How both of us built something, him a fraud, me a career, through repeated choices. And how one choice to break the pattern changed everything. He's in prison. I'm free. And maybe that's the only justice anyone gets. Not perfection. Not absolution. Just the knowledge that you did what you could when it mattered most. That you chose truth over comfort. That when the moment came to decide who you were going to be, you chose right. Even if it cost you. Even if nobody thanked you. Even if you're still not sure it was worth it. You chose right. And that has to be enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.